So welcome everybody. I'm Andy Miller. I coordinate the seminar series for our department. And so we're very happy to have you join us. We are recording this. It will be posted later. I'm just going to quickly share a screen to show you what's coming up shortly. And then I'm going to turn it over to Felipe, who is going to do the introduction. So for main thing I want to point out is that next Wednesday at noon, we have an in-person seminar with Dr. Amanda Phillips DeLucas, who's director of the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. And she has a new book that was published back in January called Justice on the Interstates. It's about the intersection between the development of the interstate highway system and racial and economic justice. So that should be interesting. And then just the following week, we have Dr. Jaman, I'm not sure I have the correct pronunciation, Vandenhoek from Oregon State University, and that's going to be about conflict ecology, remote sensing of environmental change in relation to processes of conflict, displacement, and resilience. So that one will be virtual. The one next week will be in person. And with that, I am going to turn the floor over to Felipe, and he will do the introduction. So I'm going to you just a second.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Felipe. I'm a PhD student in the department, and I'm going to just introduce Dr. Sumalika Biswas. He's an assistant project scientist at Forest Ecosystem and Global Change Lab in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at the University of California, Los Angeles. She used satellite and drone imagery in conjunction with field data, machine and deep learning models, and programming to address interdisciplinary research questions in ecology, land system science, conservation biology, and fire ecology in the tropics. Her current research focuses on mapping forest phenology and land cover change in the Dja landscape on the Cameroonian Congo Basin. Prior to joining UCLA, she was a postdoctoral level ecologist at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, where she worked on mapping forests in Myanmar and Brazil. Sumalika received her PhD in geographical science from the University of Maryland, College Park. Her PhD dissertation focused on contemporary forest cover dynamics in Myanmar. She has worked in Myanmar for almost 8 years during the brief democratic transition period in Myanmar. During her PhD, she also served as program assistant at NASA Land Cover Land Use Change program and as short-term consultant for the World Bank. Thanks, Sumalika.
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Felipe, and good afternoon, everybody. So today I'll be talking about forest change in Myanmar through the lens of socio-political events and remote sensing. And the reason I decided to speak on this topic is because I believe that it was a unique experience conducting research in Myanmar, a country which was open and easily accessible to researchers for a very short period of time in its history. And that's the experience I'm looking forward to share with all of you. And so a bit of the background. So understanding changes in forest cover is important for nations' environment, social, and political commitments. And more so for Myanmar, because formerly it was under military government from the West. So they did not get to participate in international events, especially like
your audio, excuse me, Sumalika, your audio is coming in and out. I don't know if everybody else is hearing it the same way, but I don't know if there's anything you can do to try to make sure the sound's coming through.
Is this better? Or
that sounds fine. That sounds fine. It was just like you're clear, and then we just don't hear anything, and then we hear you again. So let's just do the best we can, because I don't know that we can actually really do too much for that right now. So go ahead, put your slides back up, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you.
So too, because I'm on a Wi-Fi. And yeah, and then back when I was starting this study around 2013-14, it was the time where studies reported Myanmar as a hotspot of forest loss. So according to the global FRA assessment in 2015, they reported that Myanmar had the highest rate of deforestation, the third highest rate of deforestation after Indonesia and Brazil. And so if you look into the forest resource assessment reports over the years, Indonesia and Brazil are like one of the top deforesters globally, and they do have a high rate of deforestation. But Myanmar was never in that group. I'm sorry, the circle moved from Myanmar to India, but then it's the neighboring country. It's here where I put my cursor. And we wanted to know what happened. And when we looked more into the data sets, more spatially explicit forest loss data sets from the Global Forest Change data by Hansen et al. 2013, we found that between 2001 to 2013, Myanmar had the highest forest loss in the entire region of mainland Southeast Asia, and much more forest loss than its neighbors, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. And then of course, we wanted to know that what's going on in the country that is suddenly shot up among the major deforestation. But then, unfortunately, most of the land cover dynamics for the country was largely unknown due to its history of economic and political isolation. And one of the earliest works that was done in this region was by Peter Lime Gruber in 2005, where they looked at the forest cover distribution change and the drivers of forest loss. And then we realized that the report for which the FRA 2015 looked into deforestation rates in Myanmar was for 2010. And it was during the same time that a landmark political change. So they went from being a military government to a quasi-civilian government. And we wanted to know if the institutional change affected forest cover, which we would have expected to have impacted the forest cover. And taking a step back into the land cover land use change sciences, the impact of institutional change on forest dynamics is generally a less studied area. And most of the work that's done in this area focuses on the temperate regions in Eastern Europe, where people look into the land cover land use changes that happened in Eastern Europe after the Soviet Union fell. And similar studies have not been done in the tropics. And so the effect of institutional change is largely unexplored. And Myanmar provided an opportunity to build it. So if you look at the diagram before, on the left, I have a physical map of Myanmar where you see that the forests are along the borders of the country, and the center is like a dry lowland. And on the right is the political map, which shows the different states. So in Myanmar, what we call states in the US is called states or divisions or regions, depending on the population that resides in it. So the states are, which the red areas on the map are called the states, and these are the areas where the population is dominated by the ethnic groups. And the yellow areas are where the Pamars people live. And that kind of adds a human dimension to the forest cover change that we're going to look at. Because generally the conflict, the red states, which are dominated by ethnic group, also happen to be where the forests are. And there are generally more conflict events in those states compared to the yellow regions, which is more central, and the government has more control over the yellow parts of the states. And taking a step back to walk you through the history of Myanmar. So Myanmar has traditionally had a large forest cover in terms of area. So it's one of the most forested countries in mainland Southeast Asia. And since the British colonial period, it has been exploited for its forest resources. Mostly Burma teak, which is like the most famous that used to be. logged from Burma and shipped across the world for furniture or railways. It's one of the most durable woods that you can have. And what happened was that after the British left, they had a short period of unrest and they went into socialism till the military government took over. And the military government ruled till 2008. In 2008, and it was during this time, like before 2008, that the Western nations had sanctions on Myanmar, imposed sanctions on the country because the military was associated and illegal logging. So there were a lot of things which resulted in Myanmar being largely isolated from the global community. And it had to trade with its neighbors, mostly China, and to a limited extent with. And then in 2008, what happened is that the military came up with this new constitution under which they decided to transfer power to the civilian government through a so the deal was that first they'll have a quasi-civilian government and then move on towards democracy. So after the constitution was formed in 2008, under the same constitution, they had their first elections in 2010. And as a result of the elections, they formed this quasi-civilian government, which is like partial military, partial civilians. And that government took over in 2011. And what happened during that period, so on your left, I have the Myanmar forest loss map from 2001 to 2017. And as you can see that the forest loss is continuously increasing. And this is a common trend we see in most tropical nations. And what we wanted to first see that we know that the FRA said that Myanmar has the third highest rate of deforestation between 2010 to 15. And that's the same time that the political transition from military government to the quasi-civilian government took place. So we wanted to see if the democratic transition affected the forest loss in any way. And a way to do that was to first find if the increasing trend in forest loss is exceptionally high or low from the existing trend. And I looked into Cook's distance, which identifies outliers in a data set. So I have the Cook's distance plot on the right. And here, any point that deviates from the zero line is an event which impacted the forest loss, in the sense that those were the years where we see abnormal forest loss from the regular trends. So on the left map, if you notice in 2008, between 2008 to 9, there was increase in forest loss as soon as the new elections were announced and they decided they would have a new government because of institutional weakening during the period. And then from 2009 to 11, the forest loss decreased. This was mostly due to a weakening of the institution and confusion about who's in charge of the logging permits and how the logging process actually works. But once in 2011, the new government took over, we see a very steep rise in forest loss, which continues till 2014. And what happened was that during this time in 2011, when the new government took power, they announced a lot of concessions, mostly agricultural concessions, to grow oil palm and mostly rubber. At that time, rubber prices were very high globally, and there was a huge demand in the global market for rubber. So they established rubber plantations at the cost of forests, and that led to a very rapid rate of forest loss in the country. And when they realized that, in 2013, they decided to impose bans and ban timbers. So what happens in Myanmar is that you have forests, and most of these are high quality wood. So in order for somebody to establish a plantation, they would have to first cut the forest, sell the timber, and then establish the plantations. And in most cases, what happened is that people would use the concessions to deforest the land, sell the timber, and not establish the plantations. And so what happened in 2013 is that the new government, they announced a ban on the raw timber export, and the ban was announced in 2013 but implemented in 2014. So between 2013 to 14, at the national level, we see a huge rise in forest loss, a very steep rise. But in the following year, after the ban was actually implemented, we see that the forest loss falls. And then in 2015, they had another election, which kind of also overlaps with the ban. And so we don't know that for 2015, when we see the fall in forest loss, whether it's due to the timber ban only or the timber ban election combined or just the election. Because if you notice, going back in 2011, the election year also had a drop in forest loss rates. And then again, after the election was over, forest loss increased again in 2016 when the government announced a second ban. And then that controlled forest loss a bit. So at the national level, we see that the democratic transition in 2011 had the maximum impact because it has the highest cook distance value, the big peak here. And then the other election in 2015 had a lesser impact. And then the forest bans did have very small impact, like the magnitude here is very low from the zero line, but they did all help to control the forest loss. And then going back, if we compare across the timeline, based on our observations, we divided the transition to democracy into 3 periods, from 2001 to 8, which was when the country was strictly under military rule, the transition to democracy from 2009 to 2012, when the new government took over and they were just in the process of forming and establishing offices. And finally, the post-democratic transition from 2013 till the end of the study period in 2017, when the new government was actually established and enforcing the different bans and other policy changes. And then we see that the rate of forest loss was actually the least during the period of 2001 to 8. And then it almost doubled during the transition to democracy and became 4 times compared to the time under military government during the post-democratic transition. And this kind of reflects that once we open up the country to the global economy, there is a rapid change. There's a rapid rise in forest loss due to the adjustment of the institutional factors and the loopholes that are there while the new government is adjusting the new policies. And even though the new government tried to bring down the forest loss with the different bans, it was still very high because of the concessions and the demands from the local government of the global market, which led the local people to deforest at a much higher rate than the government could control. And while this happened at the national scale, we'll look at what happens in the regional scale. So Myanmar has 14 states and 1 union territory. And in this is like, I have a lot of these graphs. So what I would like you to focus on in this slide is that the highest peaks that you see, the abnormal forest loss years, all come after 2011, after the new government started. And the only change, the only state which differs is the Naypyidaw, which was their capital. And then I'll go to the specific examples and walk you through how the forest loss and the socioeconomic events and policies work together. So coming to Naypyidaw, so the Naypyidaw was the new capital of Myanmar under the third constitution. Earlier, it used to be Yangon, but then with the third constitution, the government decided to shift the capital to Naypyidaw, which was like literally middle of nowhere. And moving the new capital meant that they needed better infrastructure. They had to build roads, connect the new capital to the rest of the country, and construct new buildings to house the offices for the government officials and hotels for the visitors who come to the capital to get their government work done. And Naypyidaw as a city was a zoned city, so like movement was restricted from one zone to another for foreigners. And what we see that in 2008, there was a very sharp rise in the forest loss patches in Naypyidaw, which coincides with the time that the third constitution announced that they would be establishing the new capital. And that is the year where the highest impact was made on the forest loss patterns. And on the right, I have Landsat images, which show the same area at different years. So in 2007, this was just forest, and this is in central Myanmar. So the forests are very dry forest, like it's dry deciduous thorn and mixed deciduous forests. And in 2008, the next year, in the Hansen data, when we overlay the Hansen data set on the same Landsat image, we see the forest loss pixels. And in the next year, you can see the road clearly on the Landsat images. Next, we look at another state called Tanintharyi. So Tanintharyi is like the southern tip of Myanmar. It's very close to Malaysia, and it's a tropical forest. And if you look at the Cook's distance plot, the earliest effect of policy we see on forest loss in Tanintharyi is in 2000 small palm. And this actually coincides with the time when rubber plantations were introduced as a part of the government's program for their development and self-sufficiency. And then moving ahead in time, 2000, after 2011, after the new government came in, they had exceptionally high rate of forest loss. And once the ban was implemented in 2014, that dropped quite a bit. And they have the same pattern as the rest of the country post 2011, showing that logging was controlled. So post 2011, under the new democratic government, the quasi-civilian and democratic government, they did have very high rate of forest loss compared to the previous period. But then the timber bans that the government implemented also helped to bring down the forest loss. And next, we move on to the rubber states. So there are 4 states in Myanmar which grow rubber traditionally for most of the previous time. They are called the rubber states. So that's Kaya, Kain, Mon, and Shan. And all these 4 states are kind of clubbed together in the southeast part of Myanmar. And Shan shares a border with China, whereas and sharing the border is kind of an implication that they have an easy trade route to the markets in China or Thailand to sell their rubber products. And the earliest impact of policy we see in each of the 4 states, which have very similar forest dynamics, is in 2006. And that, though comes under the military period, is kind of interesting because at that point of time in 2006, Shan was a big grower of opium in the region. And because Shan shares a border with China, most of the opium made its way to the Chinese market, which impacted the youth. And so to control that, the Chinese government kind of implemented a program where they offered farmers money to grow rubber instead of opium. And a lot of people participated in that program. And since then, Shan has been growing more rubber. And as that same program kind of spread into the nearby states and started growing. And because rubber is one of the main region, all these 4 states are called rubber states. Another interesting fact is that all these 4 regions are dominated. So they are like in the mountainous forest regions. So most of the time, the ethnic populations have a conflict with their central government. And this kind of makes them more vulnerable to land tenure insecurity. and to keep the government from grabbing the lands, they try to keep the lands productive in the sense that they grow and crop which is in demand in the international market. And here, like post 2011, all these four states show a very high rise in forest loss. And when we went to the ground, we saw that most of these were rubber plants in different stages of growth. And this photo collage is from my fieldwork in Mon State, where like rubber, you see rubber in whichever direction. Now taking a step back, like if you look at Shan here, if you compare it to the, if you compare the states, something you'll notice is that for the other three states, the bigger spikes all start at 2011. But in Shan, it starts much earlier. It starts in 2008 and never really goes back to the baseline until in 16. And a part of it is that, like in other states, Shan is Shan has more conflict compared to the other three states. We see the same pattern in another state in Myanmar, which is on the north. It's a similar conflict. So Shan and Kachin, we see that forest loss increases abnormally in 2008 onwards and doesn't really come. And this kind of coincides with the time when started announcing that they would have an election and a new government. So these areas, people in these areas, they were in conflict with the government. And once they knew there would be change in power, they started deforesting the lands at a much higher rate than the rest of the countries. And the conflict kind of helped the situation. What happened in Kachin was that because of the conflict between the ethnic groups and the government, most of the villagers, they left their village and migrated to other parts of the country, and their lands were grabbed, and plantations, especially banana plantations, were set up in Kachin. And that's something you can see on the satellite image. And most of these bananas from the plantations actually made their way to China, where it was sold in the markets. And there's a huge demand for bananas in the Chinese market compared to Myanmar. So that's the route they took. And here on the extreme right, I have high-res images of Google Earth. So in 2005, you can see that these slopes of Shan were heavily forested. There was almost no sign of clearing. But the same area in 2010 was cleared. So all these brown patches are land that has just been cleared. And here near the road, these patches are the places where rubber was actually planted. So we also tried to look at the drivers of the forest loss using the forest loss data sets we had. And we divided our forest loss data into patches which had 0 to 50 pixels. So those were the forest loss patches. And the larger ones were like more than 100 pixels. And we found that most of the patches of the smaller patches, 0 to 50 pixels, tended to lie in areas Yangon, Naypyidaw, and Mandalay, which are the cities. In Myanmar, these are like the big cities, the three big cities, and which kind of implied that a loss in the smaller patches was mostly driven by urban expansion, whereas the loss with the higher patches lay in Kaya, Mon, Kain, Bago, and Shan, which were more the plantation areas. So from this, we inferred that loss, forest loss, which tended to be bigger patch size, was actually driven by plantation establishment and expansion. And finally, we did a time series comparison. So where we compared fragmentation indices of a state at the state level from 2011 and 2015. So we calculated the fragmentation indices for every state for the year 2011 and ranked them from highest to lowest, like rank 1. And we did the same thing for 2015. And then we found the rank change. And with 3 of these indices combined, we realized that from 2011 to 2015, under the new government, the drivers of forest loss actually changed from agricultural plantations to infrastructure development. And tying this back to the policy means so that what happened was in 2011, when the new government came in, they started giving out concessions, mostly agricultural concessions and logging concessions, which kind of led to a very rapid rise of agriculture and logging concession all across the country. But over time, by 2013, when they realized that this wasn't good for the country's forests, they shifted the focus to infrastructure development because they were trying to integrate Myanmar as a country into the global economy, connect Naypyidaw to the rest of the hubs. And there was more urbanization as there was more movement due to the new economic integration. And these fragmentation indices kind of agree with that situation on ground. And next, I'll be focusing on one of the states, the Shan State that we talked about, to show how the global market forces and poorly defined land tenure lead to transition and forest loss. So, a Shan State in eastern Myanmar, which actually shares a border with China, it's like more, and traditionally they grow rice. And when we looked at government statistics, we saw that though the prices of rice was increasing between 2012, the rice production was actually decreasing, which is kind of not what we expected. Because if the price of a commodity increases globally, generally farmers tend to grow that product. And this was further confirmed when we look at the area of rice that was sown, harvested, and link that to the production, that over time people were sowing less rice and thus harvesting less rice. And we didn't know what was happening, why people were not planting rice when that's what they have done for many years in that region. And then complementary to rice, we saw that maize, which had a higher demand in the Chinese markets because it's used as an animal feed, China and the rest of the world, was in higher demand. And though the maize price during the same time was very variable, the maize production increased. And then again, we looked into the area sown, harvested, and produced, and that clearly showed that every year more and more maize was sown and harvested. So, and when we combine these two statistics here on the left of plot, we see that over time, the sown maize is increasing, whereas the rice is decreasing. And between 2016 to 17, like these 2 years, the area of the sown maize almost doubled from 4.3 to 8.7. However, like one theory was that, okay, because there is a higher demand, people are not plants and they prefer because they know that the sell across the border and they generally would get a good price, even though the maize price was very favorable during this time. They were expecting to get a good price. And the rice farms were converted to maize farms. But the volume of the maize they produced did not justify that only the rice farms were converted to maize farms. And so we kind of expected that they may be encroaching into the nearby forest to increase the farm size, which kind of looked that we guessed right. Because when we compared the trends in area of forest loss versus the maize zone, they're almost parallel. So from this, we kind of concluded that, yeah, it was true that maize was replacing rice, but also like some of the new maize farms came at the cost of forest conversions. And this a whole agrarian transition was possible due to two factors. Like the demand of maize in the global market was just one of the factors, but then there was also land tenure issues. So since Shan is an ethnic state, and there's also a conflict in that state, of the farmers were generally insecure about the tenure of the land. And to keep the land productive, they wanted to plant maize. So the land was not seemed unproductive and couldn't be grabbed by somebody else. And in addition to that, the local population structure in Shan State played a very big role. So in Myanmar, according to the latest census they had in 2014, Shan has a population where 70% of the people work in agriculture, and it has the lowest unemployment rate in the whole country. So most of the people from other states move to Shan to work in the agricultural fields, which also makes Shan the second, like the state, the third, with the third highest migrant population after the big cities like Yangon and Mandalay. And the workforce, which is generally 15 to 64 years in most countries across the globe. In Shan, the workforce is not only limited to 15 to 64, the working group, but also they do employ a lot of children between the ages of 10 to 17, which kind of reflected in the poor education statistics across the state. So in short, like Shan had the land, the institutional factors, and the labor force to make the transition, the agricultural transition happen at the cost of the forests in the region. And then the next thing I would like to talk about is developing Myanmar's forest type map. And I believe that this was the first forest type map for the entire country. This part of the work was done when I was at Smithsonian. And with the opening of the country in 2011, that a lot of researchers had access to the country, and with the free, safe access, you could go to places where formerly one couldn't go under the military. And except for the conflict areas, you could go anywhere in the country. This kind of helped us to collect a lot of valuable data types across the country. So here on the figure on your left, all the red dots are the places where we collected data, like Smithsonian and our ground partners, Friends of Wildlife, collected forest type data. We also collaborated with the Myanmar Forest Department and the United Nations, the UNFAO, and the blue crosses here. These data sets were given to us by the UNFAO, and we combined all the existing data sets to create an extensive large training data, which we put into machine learning models, random forest specifically, to come up with Myanmar's countrywide forest type map. So earlier, this effort was undertaken under the military government, but they had only mapped a part of the country because first they did not have enough satellite data coverage. So the previous map used only Landsat data. And given the cloud cover in Myanmar, they did not have enough satellite data to cover the whole country. So that was a partial map. Whereas when we started making this map, we had extensive training data, ground data from all parts of the country, the non-conflict parts. And we had access to Earth Engine with its plethora of satellite data sets. So we ended up using Landsat Sentinel and the radar data sets, Pulsar and Sentinel-1, in a machine learning model to get this map. And we were successfully able to map 9 categories with an overall 80% accuracy. And in the map, the middle figure, you can see that all the magenta color here, these are the plantations, and they kind of are so close to the border, especially this part. And then we have bamboo forests. So this is something interesting in Myanmar, that bamboo forests in the western part of Myanmar in Rakhine State is considered a part of the natural vegetation. So it is not considered as forest degradation. But in central Myanmar here, this is Bago, where they have all the Burma teak here. And here bamboo is considered to be a degraded species. So bamboos are considered to be a proxy for degradation here. And in most of Myanmar, what we found was that Myanmar has much more bamboo. Outside Rakhine, it's a sign of degradation, and that's what we didn't know when we started mapping this. And one of our biggest achievements in this mapping process was that we were able to map the central dry forests in Myanmar with a very high accuracy. And in the past, it has been a research problem that forests in central Myanmar, they were hard to map because of the because there were not enough satellite images, and mapping dry deciduous forests is hard if you don't have enough training data. But because we had training data and sufficient satellite images, we were able to map the dry deciduous forest well. And here, this place where I have my cursor is the Chathin Wildlife Sanctuary. Smithsonian's worked there for a very long time. And we know that in our map, it showed that this place has dry deciduous and mixed forest, whereas the other maps that were available during that time for Myanmar at the same resolution were unable to map that. So there was one Myanmar National Land Cover map, which maps the same area as woody vegetation. So here, when they say woody, they mean non-forest, other wooded lands. And another one, Myanmar Land Cover and Land Use Map in 2016, they mapped this area as shrubs and grasses, which is not a forest cover. So this is something that we hope that in future people will be able to use. And this map was ground truthed, so there was an earlier publication which did plot data analysis, and they have the same reports that we produce, that Chathin is dominated by mixed deciduous and dry deciduous forests. So once we had the forest type map, we overlaid fires because Myanmar has a very large number of fires in that region, to see how the fires and forests interact. And at the national level, we found that most of the fires occurred in mixed deciduous bamboo, upland evergreen, dry deciduous, and lowland evergreen forest. So we expected the dry tree species like mixed deciduous to have higher fire incidence because they have low moisture content and a high fuel load. So of having a high number of fires in those forest areas was expected, but we were surprised to see fires in evergreen forests, especially the upland and lowland evergreen. And what we found is that the upland evergreen forests were mostly associated with shifting agriculture, whereas the fires in the lowland evergreen forests were due to plantations, establishment, or extension. So the figure on the left here, the magenta fires, these are the fires in upland evergreen areas. So a characteristic of these is that they are on the mountains, they're far away in remote areas, there's no easy transportation route. Whereas the other three panels, B, C, and D, the green boxes show fire in the lowland evergreen forest, and in each of the pictures, you can see that it's near a road which borders a plantation. So most probably these fires were set to expand the plantation. The same in C, so it's along this road, and the fires kind of tried to clear the nearby forest, so the plantation expands into the nearby forest. And D is on a river side, so the access here is provided by a river, and these small patches could be subsistence agriculture. But in short, like the message was that fires in evergreen forests were associated with land clearing, and in Tanintharyi, mostly oil palm plantations. And finally, because we now know that the fires were used to clear lands, we used fire as a proxy for forest loss and tried to see if the protected areas were effective at protecting the forests in Myanmar. It comes from the fact that big criticism that the parks in Myanmar don't work and they are just paper parks. So we put that hypothesis to test, and we developed a fire susceptibility map using percent tree cover, elevation, slope, aspect, land cover type, and temperature. And as expected, like central Myanmar had a lot of fires. So protected areas in central Myanmar were more susceptible to fires than the ones in extreme north or south. And basic statistics showed that the mean fire density in non-protected areas was 2 times higher than protected areas. But when we put this through a propensity score matching, which compared the variables from 1-to-1, like apples to apples, we found that protected areas have 11% less fires than non-protected areas, which means that protected areas in Myanmar are effective to some extent. That brings me to the end of my presentation. So most of the work I presented today was conducted during my PhD at University of Maryland College Park, or my postdoc at Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute at Front Royal, and supported by NASA Land Control. I'm thankful to all my colleagues in the US, Myanmar, and elsewhere without whom this work would not have been possible. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Sumalika, for an interesting presentation. We have some time for questions, so I want to invite people to just indicate if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to just put something in the chat to say I have a question. We'll call on you in the order in which you post those. So by all means, just go ahead and let me know if you've got a question. Molly, are you asking a question?
Yeah, I was just interested in hearing, or thanks so much for the presentation. Really interesting to hear about this work. I was interested in hearing more about the fieldwork component after you were doing this analysis and satellite imagery, making that connection with your fieldwork and what you were looking for in your fieldwork when you're out there.
So I made multiple trips to Myanmar. So during my PhD, it was more focused on the forest conversions and fire dynamics. So we visited some sites just to note that why people are setting the fires and what would be the purpose. Is that something they traditionally do, or is that something new they're doing under the government? And we interviewed people to figure out the land tenure and how they try to protect their lands from the government. And initially people were a bit hesitant to speak about it, but then after some time they opened up. We spoke to the forest department folks about the different policies they think could be helpful and to verify some of the trends that we're seeing. So when we work with satellite data and we have the census data, the human layers, it's just different data sets, and I'm trying to make sense of it. It may be correlated, but may not be the causation. So we needed the field work to talk to the people and the other agency stakeholders to make sure that we make the right connections and we're not overlooking anything. My work at Smithsonian was mostly focused on collecting data for different like forest type points and working with the government and the FAO to come up with a map they could actually use for their greenhouse gas estimations and the UNFCCC reports. But then by the time we had the map out, the coup had already happened and they had gone back to being the military government. So the maps were actually never used.
That's wild. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Well, while we're waiting, I will go ahead and ask one. So I was interested when you were presenting the comparison of trends in both rice agriculture and maize, see those trends sort of going in opposite directions. And then you pointed out, though, that you thought that much of the maize agriculture actually was intruding into forested areas, which led me to wonder. So here's what I was wondering. First of all, you said that there's a large population of migrants, and so presumably they could move to wherever the work is. So maybe some of them were involved in rice agriculture, and then when land was cleared in the forest for maize, they went over there. But does this mean that a fair amount of the land that was in rice agriculture was actually just taken out of agriculture, and the people working on it shifted? And the other thing I'm curious about is this one of those situations where there are small agricultural, small farmers who are doing most of this, or is there sort of a large landowner industrial agriculture that's pulling people in to do this kind of farming in the maize areas? I mean, I don't know.
So my understanding after talking to people and the different NGOs was that, so first for Shan, we never did the field visits in Shan because it was a conflict area and we were not allowed to go there. And then when I spoke to NGOs who work in that area, my understanding was that most of the farms are smallholder farms. So it's, but then they replaced the rice fields with planting maize. And apparently farming maize is easier than farming rice in that landscape because the area is a plateau area. Flooding the rice was hard for them, whereas maize can grow in dry areas. So for them, it was less work. And some of the NGOs, I wouldn't say NGOs, but some companies had provided them incentives to plant maize. So at the end of the day, they were making more money from planting maize than rice. And also the virgin land law, which allowed the government to take the land back from the farmers if they were not using it productively, kind of came into play. With when they had maize, they could show that they were actually actively planting things that fetched a price in the international market. So it was like many layers of institutional factors that led to that decision.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question they'd like to ask?
I have a follow-up question to that. Thank you for that talk. My head is exploding a little bit with thinking about all the dynamics going on. But I thought you said that the markets for agricultural products were driven by Chinese demand.
Mostly.
And it looked to me like a lot of the change and the growth in maize production was occurring in the Shan province and or state, and that was very close to the border with China. And I guess I didn't hear, or I wasn't clear, do the agricultural products, are they transmitted to markets in the central part of the country and then sent back to China, or are they local and then shipped right over the border since the border is so close? Or how does the agricultural product get to the Chinese market?
So they ship it across the border. So Shan shares a border with China, and they have 2 or 3 major gates to trade routes along the border. And because Shan is a conflict state, there are different factions, and each of them have relationships with businessmen on the Chinese side. So the maize that is grown in Shan is kind of shipped to China through the border gates. They don't get to the main like central part because these folks don't have a good relationship with the government. So they would rather trade with the Chinese businessmen than the government.
So is that possible, given that that relationship exists, that the farming dynamics would be driven more by the local demand with China than global prices?
It is possible because most of the maize that is grown is consumed by the Chinese market because it's used as a feed, animal feed. But then again, that animal feed is fed to animals and the meat is kind of shipped around the world. So part of it goes to meet the demands of the Chinese population, I'm guessing, and the rest is shipped around. So China's like the big processor, and from there it goes to either the country or different parts of the world.
Thanks for clarifying that and helping me with my understanding. It sounds like a really dynamic situation. Wow.
So in Myanmar, because they are not so developed, they kind of tend to ship the raw products to the neighboring countries, and the neighboring countries, which are coincidentally more developed than Myanmar, they have the facilities to refine the products and ship it across the world.
That makes sense.
Okay, so does anyone else have one more question? Felipe.
I do. Sumalika,
Yeah.
thank you for your presentation. I just have one question about the land cover modeling. Does the area have a lot of forest plantations, like timber or ticks or other types of plantations, forest plantations?
So the forest type map.
Yeah, no, do like a do the models to like a forest loss models and forest like a gain?
Yeah,
They?
so we are using the Hansen data set.
Oh,
and
okay,
they
okay,
do
okay.
So all that forest loss related statistic comes from that.
And do you know if there's like a lot of commission or omission error related to forest plantations in the area?
What? Come again.
Do you know if there's like a lot of commission or omission errors related to forest plantations in the area, like confusing like forest plantations with secondary forest or primary forest?
It is so I think that the Hansen products is more conservative, and for oil plantations the signature is very different, but sometimes with mature rubber and forest are very hard to separate.
Mhm.
So when we were doing the forest studies, there was no forest type map for Myanmar as a country. So we had to use the global product. But then when I was working with Smithsonian, one of the components of the project was to come up with the forest cover map. So we do have a time series forest cover map now.
Oh, thank you.
All right, thanks to those who had questions. Thanks so much, Sumalika, for a very interesting seminar. And it's really quite impressive. This is the first comprehensive forest map for the entire country. That's kind of a big thing, I think. So it sounds like you're learning some interesting things. There's a lot more interesting questions to ask. We're going to go ahead and close out the seminar now. I'm going to turn off the recording, and we will send out the link to the recording once it's posted on the YouTube channel of the Center for Social Science Scholarship. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn off the recording now. Okay.